Well, good morning. Welcome to Adult Education at Westminster Presbyterian Church on Sunday, May 8th, 2022. Today, our topic is understanding our roles in crisis toward the work of justice. And we're joined again by Reverend Dr. Christine Hong of Columbia Theological Seminary in Decatur, Georgia. She was with us back in late February, just before Lent arrived, and we're happy to have her back again today. At Columbia Seminary, Christine Hong is Associate Professor of Educational Ministry and the Director of the Doctor of Educational Ministry program. She's also an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church USA. She teaches courses in, among other things, Christian spirituality, Christian education, intercultural and interreligious intelligence, youth ministry, and the arts and spirituality. That's quite a profile. A lot of courses there. Christine, we're so glad you've come back to be with us today, and we look forward to understanding our roles in crisis toward the work of justice.
Thank you so much for having me, and I appreciate the second invitation to come back and to be with you, both those that are in the room and those that are joining us online. So I'm going to share my screen, words that we have all heard many times now. Here we go. So you may not leave here fully understanding your complete role in crisis towards the work of justice, but it is my hope that you all come closer to not understanding what your vocation is around the work of justice, and to understand that it is collaborative work, and to have also a deeper understanding of how every congregation, every neighborhood, every family has different people for whom they have a very specific role, specific gifts, and specific vocations towards the same work of justice that we all want to see happen in our world. So we're going to begin, and there are going to be prompts throughout this presentation. I do not like a long monologue. So I would love, if you're online, that you are participating in the chat, and those will be relayed to me. And if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please do interrupt me so that we can address those, because I also really enjoy when conversations that are planned go in different directions, because I do think the Spirit can move even within a presentation that has been created like this. Those of you who are in the room, feel free also to interrupt and ask questions. And there will be prompts for you to address at your tables together. I want to introduce everybody to a resource person and a scholar who is often cited in the work of collaborative work towards justice. And here in AAPI Heritage Month, here we have an Asian American, Diva Iyer. She's a South Asian American writer, strategist, lawyer, and racial justice advocate. And we're going to be using a framework. I'm looking at a framework that Dr. Iyer has created to help and assist people through times of crisis. And Dr. Iyer has also updated this. It's called a social ecosystem for change. And she has updated this for COVID times as well. So I'm going to be showing and sharing with you the updated version. But before we get to her work, I want us to do a little bit of figuring out where we are right now. So here is a question that I'm constantly asking myself in these days. And I'm sure that you are too. The past couple of years has been really rough on all of us. And we are still in the throes of the pandemic, but also of trying to process all of the other things that came alongside and were visibilized and uncovered because of it, through it. And here are just some of those things that I have named, but I would love to hear what is missing from this chart. This is only so much space on a PowerPoint screen. So I'll name some of these. Clearly, the COVID-19 pandemic has been an overarching narrative and theme across all of our lives. Because of that, there has been death that has felt very overwhelming and unceasing. Through that, there has been grief. A lot of the grief that we have experienced has not yet been processed, has not yet been even addressed in some corners of our lives and communities at our work. Alongside that, we have witnessed crushed healthcare systems and education systems. We have experienced isolation. For some of us, that has been very detrimental, especially for many children, many immigrants, many communities that are already isolated within society in the United States. A lot of us, almost all of us who are working, have at some point worked from home. We have lost jobs. We have had a lack of childcare, and especially that impacts everything. It's sort of this ball that just kind of keeps rolling, the snowball effect of, teachers can't get childcare for their children, and even when schools open up, can't return to school. It's just a snowball effect. Therefore, we have people working from home, but also teaching their children from home. We've recently experienced and now are getting ready to fight this dismantling of rights for women. We have dismantled rights that are upcoming and have happened already, but also now upcoming because of Roe, Wade, etc., for queer people and their families. We also have, and I want to say that this has also been a pandemic, right? This historic and uncovered ongoing racism that includes anti-Blackness that has been historic, but continues to surge and is much more visibilized now across society. Anti-Asian violence that, again, is historic, but has been uncovered and is now much more visible in ways, in many ways because of social media and because of our access to these stories. But these anti-Blackness, anti-Asian violence, anti-immigrant sentiments, these are things that our communities have dealt with forever. And if it's new to you, it may be because you haven't been watching or haven't been listening, right? So these are the things that are happening and still happening. Are there other things that are not on this chart that you want to name and bring into the room? Because I think that's important. So I want to give you some time to talk at your tables and to name some other things or to express how you feel about some of the things that I've named. So I'm going to give you about a minute to do that. Matt, I'm going to lean on you to let me know if there are tables that want to share or people in the chat that want to share other things that have happened and are still happening.
A few things that have come up. The widening wealth gap that we see in this country, and which is ever present. Climate change, but not just in terms of changed weather, but all of the financial implications of that and the real effects it has on folks' lives. What was the other one I saw? Yeah, go ahead. Battles over what can and cannot be taught in schools these days, that those are these returning crises around, whether it's book bans or so-called not just lost critical race theory, those types of questions as well.
Yes, absolutely. Education, right? What can we teach? What can we not teach? What can we talk about? What can we visibilize? What can we admit to is real, and what is not going to be real, right? In the reality of the collective and in the mind's eye of the collective. And if it's not real, we can't make policy around it. We can't talk about equity around those things. So,
can I interrupt and say one more thing?
Yeah, one more thing.
Share one more thing.
Yes, I was wondering if we could address the word crisis. That even looking at the 12 on your list, it seems at least half of them have been pre-existing before the last 2 years, 3 years. Some of them have been pre-existing for decades. And so what are we thinking about when we're thinking about crisis versus things that have been around as struggles and challenges to us for a long time?
I think what crisis means to different people is really important in this conversation. So what is a crisis for some is not a crisis because it's not happening to me. So it's not a crisis for me. It's a crisis over there. So part of this is thinking theologically as well. When we're thinking about crisis, how do we think about the ways in which my movement around the world, how I live my life, how I spend my money, how I think about what's important and not important, immediate and not immediate, actually creates crisis situations for other people. So what are ways in which both that we are experiencing crisis, but also creating ripple effects of crisis in real time for other people now? So it is this way of, and what has happened in the past, my good friend, Jonathan Freund, who teaches with me as a Jewish scholar, will always say history is always on the table for Jews. I think that's true for all of us in some ways. Things that have happened in the past that are ongoing struggles are still in many ways existing immediate crises for us now. So time is not always linear. Things that have happened. So for me as a Korean person, even though there was a Korean ceasefire post-Korean War, the Korean War never ended, that is still, for me as a Korean person in diaspora, an ongoing crisis that affects me every day and affects the politics of the peninsula and therefore my life here in the United States. So we have to really broaden our understanding. Crisis, of course, there are trauma events that happen that create more immediate crises, but we are always bearing the effects of even generational traumas and crises that have happened to people that have come before us. And of course, again, I'll repeat the ways in which we are complicit in some of the crises that other people experience that we might not experience directly. So there's something really theological there about what does it mean to be a good neighbor. So I want to address that as we go forward. Thank you for the question. It's a good one. So let's go forward here. If I can do this. I know many of you are familiar with this, but I've started to teach this regularly in my classes, even when we're not doing human development or educational theory, because it is something that I've seen us have to grapple with, especially very apparently through the pandemic. And it's this Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So he has this little triangle that says the things that we need for what's at the top, which is the self-actualization. This is how, when we vision things out, right, as a congregation or in our work, in our teaching, in our daily lives, what it takes to actually achieve and actualize the visions that we have set forward. So, for instance, a congregational mission statement. And what we need for that is, for self-actualization, is to develop creativity and growth and thriving. But we need everything under this pink triangle to be able to achieve that, right? And it's not just one person that needs that thing. It's the community that needs all of these things to be able to achieve that together. But at the very bottom, I want to just say that when I first started teaching in the pandemic in 2020, when we all went online, Columbia gave us 2 weeks. We had to pause our classes and they said, you have 2 weeks to convert all of your in-person classes to online. It was a scramble because it's not as if we as professors or teachers were exempt from experiencing what was going on with all of our students' lives. We were also in the throes of that too and dealing with that. So this physiological need and the one above it, the safety need, the need for air, food, water, health, the need for safety, shelter, and stability, that was just pulled out from under all of us, right? From under, I'm just speaking specifically of my own experience as a teacher, from me as a professor in my familial life, in my concern for the elders in our family, in my concern about what COVID was and what it would do, concern for my children who suddenly stopped going to school, and now my students, caring for them in the classroom and making sure that they were checking in, that they were okay. At that point, I was not concerned about whether or not they were reading the readings. I was concerned about whether in isolation that they were okay. that they were eating, that they were connecting with people, that they had access to food, that they had access to healthcare should they have COVID, that they had transportation, that people had masks. These were very basic things that we started to be concerned about in more real ways. And I had this aha moment when I was teaching my first lecture in the pandemic when all of my students and myself had gone into lockdown. And this aha moment was, I actually don't think the lesson today that I've prepared has any relevance for what we're experiencing right now. And the cognitive dissonance was so real to me. And I just deleted the lecture. And I said, listen, from now on, all you're going to have to do is read if you can, but every week, I want you in the forum, on this online forum, just to answer simple questions. And those simple questions are, how are you feeling today? Did you eat something today? Did you drink enough water today? Did you check in with your loved ones? What do you need prayer for? And that was all I requested them to do, because we had to, as pastors, as teachers, as community leaders, we needed to take care of people's safety and physiological health and well-being. Because without that, what's above that in social, love, belonging, and inclusion could not happen and could not be experienced. It was devastating. So this was really important for all of us. And above that is the ego, right? The children, thinking about children in the early pandemic time when they were all pulled out of school and many people had to access online learning for the first time, that their need for children, they go to school to develop their understanding of self, of community, of self-esteem, of who they are, of dreaming, of learning how the world works, and having their questions recognized, acknowledged, and answered. And for many children, being at home was not a safe place. It was not a place where their self-esteem was allowed to grow, where they had agency and power, where they were recognized. Because even before the pandemic, those homes were not safe places for some children. So you add the stress of COVID-19, and there's an incredible deficit for them. And you could see it on people's faces when they were in the classroom, and they were having to learn from home, that was not a place that was a happy place for them. And so this is why this triangle here, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, is important. I believe we are still, because we are still in the pandemic, because we are still dealing with the repercussions of the last 2 years and the things that have compiled on top of that, are still working on some of these very basic things. And what's happened is that we've all had to work on these basic things, whereas before, a few people had to work on them, or groups of invisibilized and minoritized people had to work on these things, and they were not the concern of the whole. But what's shifted is at least one point during the last couple of years, these last at least bottom two, safety and physiological needs, were the concern of the collective. So there's something remarkable about that, and alarming. So here's where I want you to think about these particular questions and then to address that at your tables or just on your own online. What understandings of faith and justice have changed for you due to all of the things that we've named that we've been through? What understandings of faith and justice changed for you due to everything that we've been through and are still going through? And the second question is, today, maybe because of what you've learned over the last 2 years, which issues of injustice mobilize your spirit? I'm not asking which issues have you marched for, donated to, or written about, or taught about. I'm asking which issues of injustice today mobilize your spirit, stir your spirit. Which of those pull you? And I want to give you a minute to address those questions. Do we have any responses in the chat?
To me is a tool for social justice. And it's connecting all of us because I think all of us go to school at least to a certain level, So I'm still trying to understand it, and that's my own understanding.
Sure. Thanks. So, I can report back then.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So here are some things that came in from folks online. These look like they're mostly answers to the second question of which issues are mobilizing people's spirit. Stealing Native people's land and the ensuing consequences. Another one is being present for and nurturing children, helping children to experience faith and be kind to all, embracing differences. A third one, less of a shared sense of what justice is and more a willingness on the part of some to reject what I thought was a common shared view and need for justice. Another one, to realize power for doing good in community, also political and eco-justice. Another one, the ongoing anti-Asian violence, the impending reduction of women's reproductive rights, and the rise of anti-trans legislations. And then a final one online, helping all children grow into sensitive adults for the sake of themselves, others, and God's creation. And then here in the room, we had a good conversation about education as a means of social change, and in particular what that means for students, individual students, or groups of students in schools that don't test well, and what does that mean for kind of long range success? I think what that means in terms of resources in schools, and how sometimes, one testing program can trigger all sorts of lasting implications, probably mostly damaging in terms of the system and how the system works. And then finally, a conversation about questions of environmental justice being particularly animating right now, in part because you said you've got a son and a sister, I forget now. Sister and a grandson who both are very committed to the movement in terms of making some significant lifestyle changes. And so that's now always in the forefront of your mind, of just how important a topic this is and all of the ways in which we contribute.
Those are great. So I want you to hold all of those, what sound like kind of very different things. And I want you to look at this very busy slide. Look first at the right-hand side where you see this wheel. So this is created by Diva Iyer. You can find it. If you just Google it, you can find it. And she's got a long explanation of how this works. But all of the issues that were raised, both online and in the room, have to do with everything in the middle. And they're actually all connected issues, right? They're all connected. Even the comment about becoming aware that our ideas of justice are actually misaligned in many ways with one another's, and one person's understanding of what is a justice need is not necessarily my understanding, etc. Those are conflicts that exist even in social justice movements, right? Where we don't agree on how a movement should be borne out, or what should happen throughout, or who should be leading it. Those are conflicts that are even existing in movements that are successful. But here in the middle, I want to point to all of these words: equity, inclusion, liberation, justice, solidarity, resiliency, and interdependency. Those are the things that we are seeking around all of those issues and topics that are stirring and mobilizing your spirit. Those are the things that we are seeking around those issues of eco-justice, climate justice, anti-racism. All of these things seek equity, inclusion, liberation, justice, solidarity, resiliency, and interdependency. How do we get there? How do we get there? How do we get there, especially in understanding Maslow's hierarchy, when many of us are still struggling with what is at the bottom three, perhaps, of that pyramid? We want to get to the top. We want to get to the self-actualization of what is here in the yellow circle in the middle. We get there by understanding our role. Not all of us have to carry the weight of all of the roles in our communities that get us to that middle dot, that middle yellow circle. We have to understand that we are interdependent on one another to be able to get to that place. So I want to introduce you to the roles that Diva Iyer has mapped out for us. And she says, in every community, every congregation, every neighborhood, there exists somebody whose vocation, I'm using the word vocation, she does not, whose vocation is one of these, at least one of these roles. Some people have multiple. There are healers in our communities. And I'm not talking about just people that lay hands and heal. I'm talking about people that can really see the woundedness in people and what needs to be mended, and to name it and address it and bring healing around through conversation, through providing access, all of these things. Healers. We have visionaries. We have people in our communities, even in our families. These are often children who can cast vision, who can say, you know what, despite everything that's happening, I still am able to dream and see that this is where we need to be and that we can get there. I have hope. We have visionaries among us. We have storytellers. Storytellers can be any age. Our older adults tell stories. Our youngest people in our families and congregation tell stories. And these storytellers also are truth tellers. These are not just people who are telling fantasies. They're telling the truth about what has happened and how that relates to what is happening today. They are telling the truth about God's deepest desires for us as humanity to move forward in equity, justice, and love. They are telling truths that are often very hard to hear. Think about Jesus. Jesus was a storyteller, and those stories were not just figments of, fantasy. Those are stories about the truth of our condition, our human condition. There are disruptors among us. Disruptors are people that know that, sometimes change is too slow to come. Sometimes forming a committee about the committee is actually the wrong thing to do, right? Presbyterians, we love this. Let's form a committee about how to form the committee. So disruptors are the people that will disrupt change that cannot come because of all the impediments that are in its way and just make it happen. And I'm going to show you an example of a disruptor. There are frontline responders. We really know who these are now. People in the healthcare system, teachers, people who are in our grocery stores, people who are driving our Ubers and Lyfts. These are the people that have really put their bodies and their entire families on the line, the people that are connected to on the line to make sure that we can do the things that we are accustomed to doing on a daily basis at the risk of their lives. And many people died because of this. Frontline responders in their communities are also people who see a need. And you know this, if you have a crisis in your family or you have a crisis at your church, who is the first person that you know that you can call who will have a clear head and be able to respond with immediacy? Who is the person who's going to answer the phone and make sure that people get what they need and who will know what the next step is? That's your frontline responder. Can you envision the face of that person? Who are the bridge builders? The bridge builders are the people that can see that, hey, you know what? In our neighborhood, in our congregation, we have people with such different opinions that they can't even be in the room together. But I think I know how to bring them into the room together. And I'm going to help facilitate that. And I'm going to, no matter how much time it takes, help build relationships towards the meeting of those people. So even if they can't resolve the conflict, that it might be managed. Sometimes we can't talk about conflict resolution. That's a legal term, right? We can't talk about that in terms of a life in community together. We have to talk about management. How do we manage our conflicts enough, our differences enough, that we're able to actually strive towards what's in the middle bubble there? So bridge builders are able to see ways to bring people together, regardless of the conflicts that might exist. We have people who are weavers. Weavers are often people that are connecting the different people around this wheel together, who are saying, hey, you know what? This storyteller needs to get together with this visionary to figure out the future. And that visionary might need to get together with this healer because there's still a lot of trauma in that person's life. And maybe this person could help them through that so that they might live into their vocation of visioning in a more whole way. Weavers are able to bring together all the different pieces. We have caregivers. Caregivers are often the people in our community that just naturally know how people feel loved and are able to share that love and that care in ways that that person feels it best and understands it best. We have caregivers. Who are the people in your church that when you ask to do hospitality or when you ask to visit someone who is sick are going to do it? And do it in such a way that that person's life, that person's face, if they visit somebody in the hospital and after that visit, that person's face has changed because they actually have more comfort and peace because they were visited by that individual. Those are your caregivers. Who are those people? Builders are people that after we have done the deconstruction of the systems and the structures that are not working for us, and we say, this has to go, this doesn't work. Builders are the ones that look at what's been dismantled and say, and hey, this is what we can do with this now. It's not just rubble on the ground, but let's build something new from what we have. I put frontline responders in there twice. We have experimenters, people that are willing to try new things. Hey, let's try this out. I know we've never done it, but who are not afraid to fail, right? These are people who they're going to risk their ideas because they know that when an idea doesn't work, that it actually births new ideas, new innovations, that you can't innovate if you don't know what fails and what works. We also have guides. Guides are people in the community. Often there are guides in intercultural communities. So when you have immigrant communities, for instance, around you, there are going to be guides within those communities, that cultural guides are going to help people outside of that community navigate internally in that community. My parents had those when they first immigrated to the United States. They had a pastor that picked them up from LAX, that introduced them to people in their congregation, and eventually they were able to find work. They were able to rent an apartment and borrow a car for some time before they could afford another used car. These were guides. And without that person, without that pastor who was the guide in this new country with these new laws, with these new ways of behaving and being in the world, without which they would have suffered so much more than they had already suffered, right? They would have suffered. These are the people that are in our congregation. There is not one person, and I really believe this after having been through what we've been through, there is not one person in a congregation that does not have a vocation towards at least one of these things. Our job, right, as people who are leaders in our communities, is to help people see and understand what their role is on this list, and there might be multiple, but also to lean on the others, to know what their role is not as well. Some of us try to do all these things, and we let people do none of these things because we're too busy doing all these things. How do we let go of the things that we know are not our vocation and our call? And how do we lean into the things that we know God is actually calling us and has gifted us to do? I'd like you to take a minute, look at this list, and I want you to think, which are the roles that think about that question that I asked about, what in your spirit is being pulled and mobilized, right? Think about that issue that you've raised concern about, mobilization around. How would you approach that issue? Which of these roles speaks to your approach? Are you an organizer? Are you a truth teller? Are you a disruptor? Are you someone who's going to care give? Are you a frontline responder? Are you an experimenter? I want you to take a minute and see if you can name which of these roles seems to call to you the most. Which of these represents how you've responded in crisis? I want to actually keep us going because we're running out of time, because I want to show you a couple of examples of who some of these people are in our world right now. And I'm sure you can think of more. This is a scholar and an artist, photojournalist. Her name is Matika Wilbur. Matika Wilbur is an Indigenous photojournalist who created this project called Project 562. She is who I call a storyteller. She uses photojournalism to change the way that Native people around the world, but particularly in North America, are perceived by the public. And so she says this about her work: "My goal is to unveil the true essence of contemporary Native issues, the beauty of Native culture, and the magnitude of tradition, and expose her vitality. As we know that that often the perspective and that is laid and mapped upon Native people all over the world is that of scarcity, is that of all of the stereotypes that you could name. And some people don't even know Indigenous and Native people are still here. I've had children ask me if we have Native people here, right, in Georgia. Yes, we do. But this incredible invisibilization that Native people have experienced, but also the mapping over that they've experienced by the greater, and this is planned by the federal government, right? There are not all tribes, for instance, are federally recognized. Some are not. So how do you claim Indigenous heritage federally if your tribe is not recognized, for instance, right? Your community is not recognized or named. Blood quantum is another way that happens. So Matika Wilbur started Project 562 to refute all of these lies and to proclaim truth. Again, storytellers are truth tellers. You can go to her website, just Google Project 562, and you'll be able to see all of her beautiful work. Every photo is accompanied by a story. This is my example of a disruptor. This is Brie Newsome. I think everybody knows who Brie Newsome is now. She's done many things visibly in the public sphere, but this is an instant where I felt like she lived into this disruptor role. So weeks after Dylan Roof murdered 9 people at Mother Emanuel AME in Charleston, there was also this ongoing conversation that was happening at the state capitol at the time about the Confederate flag that was flying in front of the Capitol. Do you remember this? It was a parallel conversation during this time. And they were like, you need to take that down because of everything that implies explicitly, implicitly, all of that. And there was, we'll talk about it. There was all of this just public outcry, but lawmakers just wanted to have a conversation. Well, Brie Newsome, after the 9 people were murdered at Mother Emanuel AME, climbed this 30-foot flagpole at the State House and took it down herself. And this is what she shouted as she took it down. You come against me with hatred, oppression, and violence. I come against you in the name of God. This flag comes down today. This is beautiful and very, very powerful example of someone disrupting. We could have gone through all the policies and all of the committees and all of the conversations and arguments. But Brie Newsome knew what had to happen. She climbed the flagpole and took it down because she knew it was the right thing to do. It was the right thing to do. Disruptors are those among us with the fierce courage in spite of fear that have the ability to cut through the red tape and just see what has to be done and have the courage to do it. It's really, and she has continued to do that throughout her work as an activist. So another example that we don't have time to show you, I wanted to show you an example of someone who is a weaver or a bridge builder. And for me, that example is Dr. Greg Ellison. I'm going to stop sharing now. Dr. Greg Ellison at Candler, who's a practical theologian, but has developed this wonderful resource called Fearless Dialogues. And Dr. Ellison is an expert in bringing together community people, not only community leaders, but members of the community for hard conversations and helping them see each other. And he has this wonderful practice that is probably the hardest thing that I have ever done, which is he has people from very different, even opinions, different sides of a conflict sit together, face each other in a chair. And he says, for 3 minutes, you're going to look into this person's eyes. And he calls it the gaze of love. And you're going to gaze lovingly at them. Can you imagine? Imagine your mortal enemy, right? Or the person that you have the most conflict with sitting across from them and gazing into their eyes without saying anything. It is really hard. Not everybody can do it. Not everybody can do it, believe me. But even with someone that you know and care about, this is hard. Think about the person in your family that you struggle with the most, having to sit across from them. You love this person, you struggle with them, and gaze into their eyes with lovingness for 3 minutes without saying anything and having your eyes say it all. But not only that, to receive that same gaze of love from them. How transformative that is. bridge building. He is able to develop these tools that help people really see each other across difference and maybe not resolve conflict, but at least manage it so that we can get to equity and justice together. So I hope that today, I think, Matt, are we out of time? Okay, I hope today are we okay?
We have about 5-7 more minutes if we want to.
Okay, so I'm going to take questions now. So if there are questions or insights that you want to share, I would love to hear that.
Can I start with one? I found the slide of the 10 or 12 different roles really, really helpful to not just to think about a system and what you need for social change, but also so that everybody can exhale every now and then and realize they don't have to do it themselves. Or if I'm not a Brie Newsome, I don't have to necessarily beat myself up for that, because there's other places where I fit into a system. And I think about when crisis really hits and when things are really acute. The pandemic is one thing, but I think about George Floyd's murder almost now two years ago here, and trying to figure out, where do I fit in? How do I do something? Or how do I listen? Or how do I, and so I just kind of wonder, when you think about connecting those roles to spirituality, right, and to my spiritual health, not to give me excuses for not being involved, but rather to be strategic, to be smart, to be loving, to be part of a community. Do you have any advice on that? Just kind of like how that fits? We need to be self-aware, obviously, but we also need to know something about maybe where God is present in our lives or in our community, or where God is not present. Does that make any sense?
Yes. And one of the things that comes to mind as a response is that part of where we get stuck as communities is, number one, we don't trust each other in the roles that we have, or we push people into roles because we're too afraid to live into our roles. So that happens a lot, right? With the Black community, with other people of color communities, where they are pushed. This happens to Black women all the time. They're pushed to the front and everyone wants to stand in line behind them, while things happen to them because of what they say and do, in the name of just, not even justice, just surviving and getting, thriving, fighting for thriving. And everybody wants to just, echo what they've said, but they don't want to actually be the one standing in front of that line. So I think part of discerning what our role is, and with the Spirit, is also being honest about the times that we have not taken up the role that is upon us, right? That the Spirit wants to say, hey, you need to lean into that. You actually are a frontline responder. But part of the way that society has conditioned you to behave is to believe that you can't do it, right? You can't do it. There are too many costs to that for you. So think about the ways in which not only we can live into our roles that God is calling us to live into around that wheel, but be honest about the ways that we've been complicit in pushing people into roles that we don't want to take up because we don't think it's that because it puts us at too much risk. Power and privilege work into this wheel too. So I think that's one really, really concrete way.
I am not seeing any questions online, and I think we cut off in 5 minutes, or now in 5 minutes. Can I say one more thing then, or ask one more question based on what you said, talking about power and privilege playing a part in that wheel? Also, sometimes, of course, in damaging ways, but sometimes in really positive and helpful ways. And so I wonder about that too, in terms of a disruptor, somebody from the outside who performs a protest or something, or who speaks truth into a moment that nobody really wants to hear, is one thing. But I think also of people who use their places of privilege to either amplify voices or to do things or to deconstruct things. And maybe as Presbyterians, that's an important thing to think about, because most of our churches, not all, but a lot of our churches have influential people in them, people influential in their communities. Is there anything you want to say about that? Just to talk a bit about not to apologize all the time for one's influence, but to think strategically about how that can be used as well.
I think it's really important. And that if you have a lot of if you have a lot of power and privilege, it also means that you have a lot of access. So how do you use your power and privilege to help people that would not otherwise have access to the resources that they actually, think back to the Maslow's hierarchy, who don't have access to those things that are necessary for human survival? How do you make sure through your power and privilege that you're creating inroads? You're a bridge builder, right? You're building bridges of access. And not only access where someone is able to meet their needs for some time, but that they have access to that power and privilege too, right? That they have access to, and not to say that that is going to create new paradigms of minoritization, but that it's equitable, right? So when we have access, how do we use that access and also make sure that other people can access that resource without you at some point? I think that that is really important, that we don't gatekeep that access. And that's really hard. That's really hard because it does mean that when other people have more equitable access to the things that we already have access to, it's going to feel like a loss for the people who have power and privilege. So one thing that I like to say is the end of the story, God's story of justice, at the end of that story, some of us are going to experience freedom and liberation that we've only been dreaming about. And it's going to feel so good. And we are going to feel so in our bodies, right? And so connected to one another. For some of us, it's going to feel like loss. The end of that story of justice is going to feel like I have lost so much of the things that I have accumulated in this life. That story of justice does not end the same way for all of us. That story of God's kingdom. So I want all of us to come out together, right, at the end of that story and be whole and be well. But some of us are going to have to lose some things to be able to come out that other side together with the rest of us. And I think that's a hard truth. I think that's hard. But that's the end of the story.
Yeah, the Bible scholar in me can think of a few biblical stories that illustrate exactly what you just said, but that's maybe for another day. First of all, thank you for this presentation, for all of your wisdom and energy that you bring to these conversations. Grateful you're here, those of us in the room, but also the people watching online. So thank you for that. And then one quick announcement for everybody. Please join us next week on the 15th of May. Austin Hartke will be back with us for another session, and his topic is celebrating gender diversity in Scripture. And that looks to be great. Until then, though, thanks for joining us, and have a great Sunday or whatever day it is when you're watching this.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Christine. Appreciate it.